Thank you all for being here this morning, because this is a celebration of various different things, and in some sense very organic to the Goa Lit Fest. Because Bilal and I first met here, actually, 2 years ago, and as is the way with the Goa Lit Fest, it becomes a frame for conversations and friendships, and so it's a matter of particular joy to me to be able to announce to you Bilal's first novel, The Scatter Here Is Too Great. And this is actually the launch of the book. So, congratulations, Bilal.
Thank you. I just want to thank Ranjit for agreeing to read the book and host this conversation again. Ranjit's work has been important to me for the last 2 years. We met here for the first time 2 years ago, and I've been engaged with his work. So it's a matter of particular pleasure for me personally, for him to have this conversation. I'd also like to thank the Goa Literary Festival people, especially Vivek Menezes and Nandini Sahai for inviting me again, and this festival and this venue means a lot. Thank you.
So maybe we should now explore the book and everything that went into the making of it. To offer very brief words of background, Bilal lives and works in Lahore, although he was born and raised in Karachi, and there have been adventures in other continents between these 2 points of reference. And somehow, I think there is still what you might call some kind of ethnographic residue in terms of what is sometimes expected of people writing from certain locations. So the tendency is to speak of the Pakistani novel, for instance, which is of course a major phenomenon. There have been indeed stellar novelists and writers of short fiction emerging from Pakistan. But the fear is that, do they represent their situation, or do they bring some other kind of cognition and imaginative enthusiasm to it? What is it that actually goes on in the novel? So for me, what really seized me with your novel, Bilal, was its form, I have to say. I mean, in some sense, it's made up of fragments. It's like a mirror that's been broken up and turned into a kaleidoscope. So each chapter is in some sense a fragment, and then the whole thing gets gathered together towards the end. And in a sense, it's the key event as well as the form is that of an explosion. So do you want to talk a little bit about your choice of form?
Certainly, and I think that, just to sort of refer back to your original question of this Pakistani novel, and this expectation that you're going to write a book which is going to represent a country, that sort of arises out of a colonial history, right? Just the idea that you can represent an entire country in a book, or explain an entire country in a book is a kind of colonial project, right? You would never hear that about a book from the UK or the US. But when it comes to India or Pakistan, there would be this temptation to explain or represent the entire country in a book. Yes, and so certainly my impulse is to move away from that and make it very, very, very local, and even use the reference points that are extremely local. So when I'm trying to imagine that place, I don't have foreign reference points to explain the local reality. Rather, I try to use I make all the effort to use local references to explain the local reality. So that's the first thing. The second thing about the form, yes, the idea is the novel is made up of these 9 stories that stand on their own as well, and then they have recurring characters, events, situations that gather meaning as you go along, and by the end of it they cohere into something bigger. At least that's the hope. The form is again reflective of many different concerns. One of them is concern of narrative itself. Can a conventional narrative tell a story as complex as ours? Can it suitably accommodate many different perspectives that exist on a particular reality. And that was one of the starting points of the book, where you're trying to think about, something like a bomb blast, right, which gets flattened out, which is flattened out in the news as this one particular event, and people are portrayed as victims. But that's not necessarily the case, right? I mean, it impacts different people in different sorts of ways. For some people, yes, it might be closer to home, but for many people, for instance, there is a story about a boy and a girl who are trying to go on a date, and their date gets disrupted in a certain way because of the bomb blast. There is, but there is at the same time somebody in an apartment who doesn't get affected at all. So the idea is to sort of bring together a very layered portraiture of, something like that.
Since you've raised the trope of portraiture, now even though the novel doesn't set out to represent Pakistan in some ways, it is charged with the various crises in which Pakistan finds itself today, and this comes through the characters. And I'm particularly fond of the character called Comrade Sukhansaz, the communist who finds himself without moorings in a greatly transformed society. So in the same book, through the different portraits and the stories and the predicaments, you find, the superseded communist, the writer who has no audience, the young man who's confused as to where to belong, and the strain of kind of Wahhabization, which affects everything else that is going on. So, did you reach out to other kinds of arts in trying to produce the structure? I mean, I want to resist the temptation to link this in any way to the miniature tradition, because as we know, the miniature is now practically the official style of Pakistani art, so I don't want to fall into that trap. But having said that, it still remains a powerful source of inspiration. So I don't know if you want to think about that a little.
That's an interesting prompt, because there were certain soundtracks that I was listening to while writing certain parts of the story. So that's very deeply connected, right? I'm thinking of particular rhythms, because again, each one of the stories or chapters, however you want to look at it, are narrated from with different voices, and every voice has its own rhythm, has its own personality, has its own way of approaching the situation at hand. And its own imagined audience as well. So that voice is talking to a particular audience, and therefore emphasizing and de-emphasizing things accordingly. But in terms of visual art, actually I'm not a very visual person, and it's very hard for me to write scenes that are visual. I try to find strategies, in fact, to move away from it as quickly as I can. Writing in voices is one way of doing it, because I'm not a very visual writer. It's hard, and again, even the images that I tend to sort of write are kind of not exactly visual images. So yeah.
There's also another kind of model, and we've already talked about Bruno Schulz, the cinnamon shops, the Street of Crocodiles. And also when I'm reading your novel, I think of Elias Canetti, the Ear Witness, where there's a kind of sequence of characters who each have their own testimony and their own center of gravity, but they all gather up together into some kind of dance. So again, to pull you out of this subcontinental context, you want to talk a little bit about these other points of reference that you have, say, in European literature.
Oh, absolutely. And Bruno Schulz, whose little book, On the Street of Crocodiles, which was originally published as The Cinnamon Shops, it has been an important book for me. Because, again, I mean, I became interested, and I did not know at the time why I'm so interested in this interconnected narrative form, where individual stories are kind of linking up and gathering meaning and playing off each other and leaning onto each other for meaning. Other books that are important for me, Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities is certainly it's very, very important for me. Yeah, I mean, I think that because one of the things that you were able to do that you were unable to do in a conventional narrative is you were able to bring out the complexity of the situation, because the rhythm of our lives and the rhythm of our urban lives is very different from the narrative, from the rhythm of conventional narrative, and it is very hard for one to write about the manic pace of conventional urban life of a metropolis like Karachi in a conventional narrative. One can do it, but I mean, one does feel slightly fraudulent. At least I do. In trying to be honest to that reality. And I mean, ultimately, the key word for me, in all my writing is honesty. Am I being most honest to myself and the situation that I'm writing about and the characters I'm writing about? Because ultimately, you try to remind yourself that, it's not about you. It's about something bigger than you, or something, other than you.
This might be the moment for you to read us.
Oh, okay. Ranjit just sprung that on me. I did not prepare this. Okay, I'm just going to read maybe a couple of paragraphs from one of the stories. It's called To Live. I was sweating inside my mother's car in that freak lane, saying to myself, come on, while glancing in the rearview mirror, searching for her female figure to hurry along in my direction. All I saw was a man with densely hirsute armpits, uncomfortably seated on a chair, too small for his awesome behind, and poking a scratching stick in the back of his vest. Right opposite him, a little leftover fire nibbled at the heap of burned garbage, excreting a rancid smell I knew well from memory. It had been 3 minutes now, and nothing had emerged from the corner of the lane. I hated every second of it. I tightly clasped the ignition key. You had to be prepared when waiting for a girl you've never really met. I was in an old, clunky Suzuki FX, matchbox of a car, but I could have been off with it in less than 3 seconds, and on a bed out of the lane in the next 5, pedestrians and the incoming traffic notwithstanding. The car, if you want to call it that, was impossible to accelerate, but I had mastered that art as well. If you simply float the gas pedal, no matter your timing with the gears and all, it steadied out at around 58 kilometers per hour mark, often dwindling down to 55. I knew how to jack it up to 77 and keep it there. All this was beyond my mother's maddest dream, of course, this car being her lifeline. She had put her savings into it, that she had brought with her when she divorced my father. She treated the car like her ring dove. I thought it my fighting dog. I wasn't allowed to touch this car except in extraordinary circumstances. She was sleeping when I pushed the car to the end of the lane before igniting it and getting away with it. I'd been waiting a long time to see this girl. I'd worked hard on her. I called her before leaving the house. She said she was ready. Planning inside my mother's sleep schedule, I gave myself an hour to get back.
What really seizes me about the novel, many things, but it's the way in which it articulates the sort of violence and desperation that are just part of our normality in a South Asian metropolitan context. And, you do that also by zigzagging across a wide variety of social milieu. So, one of my favorite preoccupations really is the role of research in the writer's trade, if you will. By which I don't mean did you really talk to people, etc., etc. But what is your sense of research when you're preparing? And this book has been long in the works. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Actually, most of this book I wrote while trying to avoid research. So writing in ways and writing about things that I knew intimately, and writing stories that I knew intimately. There is one story which is, kind of natural, which is, about the ambulance driver, and he sees two creeps, and he just loses his mind. But that was inspired from from this, there used to be this column in the weekly magazine, weekly Urdu magazine that I used to love, and it was called Naqable Faramosh, the unforgettable. And people, would write in with all their jinn stories, with all the stories of the supernatural things that have happened to them. And I really loved that. So I wanted to write my own Naqable Faramosh story. So that was my attempt at that. And for that, I had to go back and read many more Naqable Faramosh stories, which I loved. And I realized why I loved this so much. So I actually don't know why I did it. But there's certainly, I researched certain things about Karachi and Karachi's past. The communists that you referred to, Pakistan had vibrant left up until the 70s, when it was really crushed during the Ziaul regime in the 80s. It was completely wiped out. Before that, obviously, it had been attacked by all the various regimes, but it was still very vibrant and it was viable up until the 80s. When it was brutally crushed. So again, but there are no documents. The archive was destroyed by the communists themselves because the state was coming after them. So the archive is not there. There is no secondary material on it. Nobody's written on it. Now there are a couple of books that are coming out, I think in the next couple of years. But there's been no history of the left in Pakistan, and that's something because again, as somebody mentioned, I think Eve mentioned yesterday, that any decent human being has gone through his Marxist phase, and I'm no different. Only one is still decent, though. So yeah, that was something that I researched. Again, in my Marxist sort of years, I did speak to a lot of gentlemen who sort of formed the basis of this communist character in the book. But what I was most drawn to was their kind of human side of it. They have grown old, but their kids don't look at them in the same way. The kids feel very, very differently about them. They feel very, very differently about this whole communism business or trying to, ostensibly live for others and so on. So that was one thing I researched. The other thing that I researched was certainly Karachi. And again, there are no sort of histories of Karachi either. The present generation does not know what this city looked like 30 or 40 years ago. So I thought, it required some work. Again, I spoke to people, I read whatever little books were available. And these are not, mostly, these are my accounts, are imagined accounts, because you have small sort of sociological surveys that here where were the strip clubs, and here there were, bars, and here there were casinos and so on. But, those things have been wiped off completely. Both from the physical thing and also from the memory. People don't remember. So you have to go and speak to some people. But again, I mentioned that in passing, but again, the hope is that for the next book, I'll go deeper into that.
And one last question before I open it up to the audience. Something else that we have in common is that we were both at the International Writing Program in Iowa at different points. And I think both of us would treasure that, and Sridhara, who's in the audience. It's rarely that writers have a sense of being in a community of other practitioners. Usually you're offering some kind of account of yourself to people who then, as Jerry said a little earlier in a private conversation, they say to you, oh, you're a writer, but what do you really do? What do you really do in the world? And then in a community of writers, you don't have to create that facade. Everybody's working on what they're working on, there's a great deal of sharing and intensity. And this festival is another manifestation of that. But in, so to speak, everyday life, how does it play out for you in terms of a sense of community among other writers in Lahore or Lahore, Karachi, or indeed elsewhere in Pakistan? Do you want to talk a little about that, those networks and friendships?
So I live on a university campus. I teach at a small liberal arts college in Lahore. And my community, and this is something I've realized actually, in the abstract, when you're thinking, when you think of a community, you think of like lots of people, but actually if you really think about it, life's too short. You don't have that much time, and all you need is like really a couple of people who can support you both spiritually and who can support you, intellectually. And so I think that is all that you require in the way of community. You certainly need platforms like this one where you can come together and exchange ideas and meet new people. But I think that in terms of your existence, you need maybe 3 or 4 people with whom you are really close to, with whom you have a resonance, in terms of your concerns and in your approach to the world. I have that. I mean, my friend Ali Sethi, who is also a novelist, he's based in Lahore, although he's now become much more interested in music, in classical music. He's been training for many years. But again, that becomes his kind of reference point in our discussions. I have some a friend who's a musician. Some of you might know. He has this band, the Gairat Brigade. He made this satirical song of Alu Ande, which became a viral hit a few years ago. Again, I share, we share a lot in terms of exchange of ideas, and also. But I think what's really important are your concerns. What are you really concerned about when you are engaged in this present moment? And I think all of us are concerned with the fact that, there is really no context in which to explain the present moment. The histories that are being presented to us, the narratives that are presented to us to explain the present moment do not really add up. And in fact, they create many of these oppressive they're actually a force of oppression, because the world is kind of divided into these broad categories of extremism, moderation, and some sort of conservative. But actually, if you sort of go out and see how people really experience religion, it's none of this. This does not explain anything at all. This is great for policymakers, but it's not a lived experience when you talk to your mother or your uncle, how they experience religion. Yeah, it's completely different for them. We all struggle with articulating this present moment and trying to come up with a context to explain this present moment. And I think that all of us are sort of, engaged in that, broadly in that same endeavor. I think that, and then, again, then you form, broader connections, for instance, and those conversations become important to you. Those things become part of your community, and I think, as I mentioned, your work has been very important to me for the last 2 years, because, again, I feel that there's so many concerns that we share, so many things that I've never paid attention to before reading your work, and so many things that I was paying attention to, but I could not articulate before I started reading your work, and so I think that, yeah.
Fabulous. So this might be the moment to invite questions and observations.
Bring the mic.
I think there's a mic down there. But just also to thank you for pointing out all these things and giving us these insights, because in India, some of us are fond of talking about the idea of India, but it's evident from what you're saying that equally there's a debate about the idea of Pakistan. What the Cairn wanted is clearly not what has happened after the Hudud ordinances, for instance. And it's amazing that on the left, we think of different parts of the left, we think of so many Pakistani figures who are prominent, whether it's Faiz or Tariq Ali, but what is happening on the ground is clearly something else. So thank you for drawing all this to visibility. And now questions.
I'll pass it around to questions, but what I want to say is that the idea of Pakistan was also helped along by a strong Goan community.
That's true.
As I continually like to point out, only one Goan has played for India, Dilip Sardesai, but 2 have played for Pakistan. And in fact, we continually produce people who voice nationalism in Pakistan, like Cyril Almeida, who's one of our invitees. Other questions? Much for another sensational session at the Goa Writers, at the Goa Art and